Today, we're talking about a railroad, but a railroad with no tracks and no trains, one that was built in the shadows, in secret, but for the people who used it, for its passengers, it was a railroad to freedom. Welcome to Journey Through Time. I'm David Olusoga.
And I'm Sarah Churchwell. And this is the first of 4 episodes on one of the most remarkable escape networks in history, the system that by the early 1840s, Americans had started calling the Underground Railroad. Now, the Underground Railroad had been taking shape since the 1780s, but it didn't always use that name. But from the 1840s up to the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861, it developed into a full clandestine network of guides and safe houses that helped people escape from slavery in the South to freedom in the North.
Estimates vary, and we will never know the final figures, but it is certainly the case that tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of people reached freedom through this system.
It was actually one of the most daring and coordinated acts of civil resistance in American history. And at the heart of the story of the Underground Railroad was a woman who escaped north from slavery herself and then went back down south again and again to bring others out. And she became the most famous conductor on the Underground Railroad, Harriet Tubman.
Harriet Tubman is an iconic and famous figure in the United States. She's almost certainly a lot less well known outside of America.
Yeah, I think that's probably right, David, but she really is iconic in America. I mean, she's taught to every school child. So she's somebody that Americans grow up knowing about. But that actually means, conversely, that even in America, where she is incredibly famous, most people only ever hear a simplified and sanitized version of her story, which is meant for children. And the real story of Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad is much more dramatic than most of those juvenile accounts, allow for. So Harriet Tubman was somebody who was gathering intelligence. She was building networks. She was memorizing routes. And she spent decades outwitting professional slave catchers, people who were legally empowered to hunt her down and return her to slavery. So it's important that we say from the outset of her story that the risks she took were just staggering. I mean, they were unimaginable. Every journey meant arrest, re-enslavement, and very possibly death. But as I think the description is already making clear, the Underground Railroad worked exactly like an intelligence operation. It was a spy network, basically. It was secretive. It was disciplined. It meant that you had to be one step ahead of the law. And at its heart was Harriet Tubman, who's basically running this intelligence network or helping to run an intelligence network. And she was the only fugitive who kept going back into slave territory to guide others out.
This is a system that, of course, linked the southern states where slavery was legal to the northern states that had, for the most part, they'd outlawed slavery, allowing people, by moving from south to north, escaping from slavery, to have the possibility of freedom in the north, to be free black people. And there was huge populations of free black people living in the northern states.
Yeah. And in between is where Harriet Tubman is born, in the so-called border states. They eventually became known as the border states because although slavery was legal within their borders, they ended up not seceding with the Confederacy, so they didn't join the South. So they're in this kind of gray area, kind of limbo space. And a lot of them had mixed economies where there was both enslaved people and then free black communities living nearby. And that's where Harriet Tubman's story begins, is in one of the border states in Maryland in the early 1820s on the Eastern Shore, about 70 miles south of Baltimore, so not far from Washington, D.C. And it's a place of low fields, marshland, waterways.
Lots of rivers, lots of lakes, lots of flat land, and a lot of space.
And partly because of the topography, this sort of territory is not necessarily going to be running plantation slavery. They're going to be different kinds of economies. And a lot of the enslavement in places like Maryland ran on a hiring out basis rather than vast plantations. So people were loaned out to small farms and towns in the area. And one of the things it does, as you say, by creating the system that makes enslaved people a little more mobile than they might be in the big plantations in the South, it means that they're a little bit scattered, but they also have wider networks. And that can become really important, obviously, if you're thinking about running for freedom. If you know more people, you have better chances by definition.
It means you can hear stories, you can hear rumors, and you can also, this is a great mechanism for how the legend, the story of the Underground Railway, how it works, what people need to know to pass through it is transmitted because people are more mobile. They get to see each other more often.
These little practical details can change everything. So the woman that we know as Harriet Tubman was born Araminta Ross, and she was called Minty. And it's only once she's free that she takes the name that we know her by now. And she was born sometime in the early 1820s, between 1820 and 1825. Yeah. Of course, careful records were not kept of the birth dates of enslaved people, so it's a guess.
This is another thing that's normal. So many of the famous people that we know who were born into slavery, we haven't got a birth date. Some estimates say it might have been 1822. There's one says it's 1825.
And similarly, it was a system that didn't recognize the marriage of enslaved people. So Harriet's parents were, in fact, married in the way that enslaved couples often were, that they were recognized by the community. They had chosen a monogamous relationship with each other. They were having children and trying to raise them together. But the law didn't recognize their marriage, and they had no marital rights that were not bestowed upon them as a gift by the enslaver. So the enslaver might let them spend time together, but they might not. And the enslaver could at any moment sell them apart from each other at will.
And this story about how enslavement created, in some ways, the greatest grievance, the greatest tragedy, which is family breakup, that's going to run all the way through this story.
It's an incredibly important driver of the story of Harriet Tubman. This story is incredibly moving in all kinds of ways. And it's probably worth saying at the beginning also that, so many of the stories about enslavement are, by definition, horrific stories of brutality. And this is a dark story because it involves slavery, but it's actually a story about people overcoming incredible odds and being able to hang on to families in a way that is, I think, really important. So, yeah, her father is a timber foreman. He's skilled, and I think some of those skills, there's reason to think that Harriet learned from him about navigating the outdoors, and he's someone who's trusted to move around. So he also has networks and knows people. Her mother works in domestic labor in the house. And in fact, her parents are enslaved by different branches of the same family. So basically like in-laws. So they can mostly stay close to their children. And as you were just saying, David, most enslaved families can't manage this. So it's quite rare for them for enslaved children to be in any way raised by their parents. But that's the experience that Harriet Tubman actually had. That said, we don't want to overstate the security as if they were sort of living a happy, normal family life. Obviously, that's not the case. And in fact, one of the early traumas of Harriet's life was that two of her sisters were sold off south. Now, this phrase "sold down the river" is still a famous idiom. It's not just a figure of speech, right? This is a literal description of a one-way journey when enslaved people were sold into the cotton fields of the Deep South.
Yeah, the economics of slavery changed in the first half of the 19th century with the invention of the cotton gin, a machine that transformed the economics of cotton as a cash crop. It made a lot of sense. If you owned enslaved people in the border states, the upper South, they were more profitable in the South. And the great highway that transported people from those upper states to the southern states were the great rivers of America. And so people were sold down the river. I mean, I guess the most famous example is Uncle Tom's Cabin. Obviously fictional, but we meet Uncle Tom. He's in Kentucky. By the end of the story, he's in Louisiana, about as far south as you can go. And so the way that phrase, the ultimate form of betrayal, to be sold down the river, comes to us, it speaks exactly the point you're making, which is that the ultimate form of betrayal is to have your relatives, your family separated, your children sold. And the fact that, 2 centuries later, it's still a phrase that we use shows just how powerful that idea was.
Yeah. And it's worth saying for people who aren't familiar with this history that part of the reason it struck real terror into enslaved people as well, is because it was well known that by and large, the closer you were to the north, there was a sense that slavery was less brutal because you weren't on these deep southern plantations. Now, of course, to a certain extent, that's a myth. Enslavement created brutality wherever it was. And, the enslavers in Kentucky were not by definition nicer than enslavers in Mississippi or Louisiana. But systemically and structurally, people were often much worse off on the plantations in the Deep South. The other important thing is that the closer you are to the north, the closer you are to freedom, not just in your imagination, but physically, and the better chance you have of escaping north to freedom. The further south you go, the harder it's going to be to get there. And in fact, for Harriet's two sisters, they were never seen again. They disappeared into the horrors of the plantation system in the Deep South. It wasn't just adults that were hired out. Of course, they were making money off of all of their enslaved people. And so they would hire out children from a very young age. And Harriet herself was sent to care for a white baby when she was about 5 years old. So she's scarcely more than a baby herself. She remembered later that she was, set muskrat traps in icy water in the river. They would make her do anything that would earn a fee for the enslavers. If somebody was willing to hire this child to do it, the enslavers would sell out her labor to do it. She also said later that she was, that one of the women that she was hired out to whipped her every single day when she was a young girl. And she quickly worked out a way to protect herself from this daily assault. She actually said she would get all of the clothes she could find, and she piled on all of her clothes before she went there. And then as the woman started whipping her, she would wail really loudly and theatrically. But she'd actually protected herself from the worst of it because she'd literally insulated herself with all these extra clothes. And then after putting on this performance of being tortured to satisfy the sadism of this woman, she would strip off her extra clothes and get back to work. And you see there, how pragmatic she was, how smart she was from a young age, and how sharply honed her survival instincts were from the beginning.
She's living in this brutal world, but she herself physically is a very sort of seemingly, at least physically, small and you would imagine fragile figure, but not at all in reality.
Not at all in reality, exactly. She's strong in every sense, Harriet Tubman. But yeah, she's tiny. Even at the time, she's barely 5 feet. She's small, but yeah, she's strong. And by 12, she'd been sent to work out in the fields. She always said she preferred working in the fields, because again, remember, we're not in those Deep South plantations. And she said she preferred it because she wasn't indoors with these vicious white women watching her every move and, getting ready to whip her. So she had a little bit of freedom. She prefers being outdoors, and that field work hardens her physically. It gives her stamina. Yeah. It gives her self-reliance. So she's completely at home in the outdoors generally, but specifically in her local terrain by the time she's a teenager.
And that's all going to come in really important. We've been talking about this very small but very tough woman, but she faces another kind of physical challenge which comes from a specific moment. Now, there is a biography that emerges later in life that she doesn't write, but she has written. And that's one of the sources for this very dramatic and what could have been a fatal incident that really does shape her life.
Yes. So as she explained, when she was about 12 years old, she was involved in an incident, one that really illustrates the kind of arbitrary brutality of slavery that we've been talking about. But it also may illustrate her personal heroism, which is going to really, shape her life story. Now, there are slightly different accounts of this. There's nothing like an authoritative account of her early years. But what happened was that she was in a town and there was an overseer that was chasing an enslaved man. And the enslaved man had run for the door of a local store. So it looked like he was trying to escape. And Harriet, 12-year-old Harriet, is just standing there. And as the man is trying to run and the overseer is going after him, she steps in between them. And it's not clear whether that was just instinctive, whether it was deliberately to block the way, to try to protect the man. But in any case, she inserts herself between this fleeing man and the overseer, just as the overseer hurls a 2-pound weight at the man who's fleeing. And it hits her instead. It hits her in the head.
this is a piece of metal. I mean, these are kind of weights we presume from scales. I mean, the descriptions of it don't make it clear, but this is a shop. They're going to be weighing things. And we presume that that's about a kilogram, a 2-pound weight from scales thrown at a child.
And hits her in the head. So it's an iron missile hurled with force, and it hits her directly in the head. She collapses instantly. Her skull was fractured, and she nearly died. Now, of course, she did not get any kind of medical care, apart from whatever, her family was able, to give her in terms of practical medicine. It took her a long time to recover, but she did recover. But the consequences of this head injury were that she was left with headaches and seizures, what we would now probably call epileptic seizures, or certainly seizures that resembled epileptic seizures. And she would collapse suddenly. In fact, she would fall into what looked like a deep sleep. So a kind of narcolepsy. She would just suddenly fall asleep several times a day. And this lasted her entire life. So she would just, out of her own control, right? She'd just suddenly fall into these deep sleeps. Now, you might think that that would be a handicap, in somebody who's going to go on to lead all of these people through these clandestine networks to freedom while they're being hunted by slave catchers. And yet she manages with this kind of debilitating illness for the rest of her life.
We don't quite know what it is. Historians have spoken to doctors, and people have had lots of sort of estimates of what sort of brain injury it was and what sorts of symptoms she carried. And, there's no medical record, so it's impossible to tell. I mean, I love the phrase that she uses to describe these moments when she falls asleep for just, a few minutes or a few seconds, when she describes it as losing time. It's got a kind of beautiful kind of mysticism. But how does she interpret this kind of new feature of her life?
During that time, she starts having these vivid dreams and what she described as visions. And because her world was steeped in religion, she interpreted these visions as messages from God. And that, again, is sustained all the way through her life, not just in these early years as she's recovering. For the rest of her life, she was absolutely convinced that she was having direct messages from God in these visions. And it's worth saying, though, from the outset that whatever this brain injury was, it clearly didn't affect her intelligence. And these messages and visions will very much shape what she sees eventually as her mission.
She mentioned she's living in a deeply religious time. And those religious stories, those biblical passages, they have very special significance and resonance to enslaved people who take certain biblical passages and see the obvious parallels in them.
There are a lot of stories in the Bible about people being let out from slavery to freedom and paradise. And those are stories that, of course, deeply resonate. Like most enslaved people, she's illiterate. Enslaved people were kept illiterate for all the obvious reasons. So she can't read the Bible, but they all know the stories. They know the stories about Moses leading his people away from Pharaoh. They know the stories about deliverance. And those are the stories that are going to shape her life.
So far, the story of Harriet Tubman is a pretty unlikely opening chapter for a woman who's going to lead what is, in effect, a resistance network against American slavery. So we should just take a break there and then come back to discover how, from that unlikely beginning, she rises to become this kind of remarkable figure in American history. Welcome back to the story of Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad. In 1840, something very significant happens in Harriet's family life.
Yes. So in 1840, Harriet's father was freed under the terms of his enslaver's will. Now, another of the sort of stereotypes about slavery that Harriet Tubman's story challenges a little bit is this idea that the enslaved were only, rarely freed, or that they were only freed through very complicated circumstances. But it wasn't that uncommon, actually, for enslaved people to be freed under the terms of their enslaver's will. It sometimes was in thanks for long service or in recognition of great age. It might be as part of the settlement of debts. There were different ways in which these things could play out. There were also Black people in the area who were born free. And one of those was a man named John Tubman, who Harriet marries around 1844. Now, this is an incredibly complicated situation as soon as you stop and think about it. You have a free black man married to an enslaved black woman. And what that means, among other things, is that any children born into their marriage will follow, by law, the phrase was the condition of the mother, which is to say, any child born of an enslaved woman is born into slavery, and the law says that that child is the property of her enslaver. So if Harriet and John Tubman were to have children, John Tubman, as a free man, would not, under Maryland law, have the right to raise his own children. Those children would be viewed as the property of Harriet's enslaver. All of this clearly makes Harriet start to ask questions about freedom and about her own legal status. Her father's free, her husband's free for different reasons, and she's clearly thinking about how she might claim freedom too, because she consults a lawyer, probably with the help of her free husband. And the lawyer that she consults finds something really remarkable. It looks to him, according to the records that he finds, or at least this is how Harriet tells the story later, that her father actually should have been freed earlier under the terms of an older will. And crucially, her mother should have been freed as well under these older wills. That means not only have her parents been kept in slavery longer than legally they should have been, it means that the children who were born to her mother after her mother was legally entitled to be free should not have been born into slavery, but were. So even in this wildly unjust system of slavery, Harriet discovers an even deeper injustice, that the injustice has been compounded by people being kept in slavery beyond when even they should have been. And I think there's no question that this shapes how Harriet starts to view her own relationship to freedom. She discovers all of this while she's still enslaved, and it obviously shapes how she starts weighing her next steps.
Yeah, she's not living in a binary society where all black people are enslaved and all white people are free. She's living in a society of all sorts of different routes to freedom, all sorts of different conditions. And she can also see that, as well as being inhumane, she's actually, her family have been in a strange way, kind of exceptionally badly treated.
Yeah. And that's exactly it, right? It's such a funny thing to think about, because obviously we wouldn't want to put ourselves in a framework where we were suggesting that there was ever something not unjust about slavery. But this level of it is, you think, well, even under the unjust law that enables slavery, we should still have been freed. And you can only imagine how much bitterness and resentment that would, provoke. But
it gets to the kind of horror, really, which is that slavery was legal. So this is a kind of legal as well as a moral injustice that she discovers, a kind of double layer to the injustice and the suffering of her family. And it changes her.
It does change her. And so all of that, and remember, we've said that the story of her life makes clear how intelligent Harriet Tubman is. So she can see all of this. And then in 1849, her enslaver dies.
Which is an acutely dangerous moment for enslaved families.
And this is because often those people would die with their accounts in some way in disarray or with serious debts.
And the debts of a man who's died, the people who pay those debts are enslaved families who are atomized.
We were talking just a moment ago about the ways in which the injustices of slavery could be compounded in these ways. And one of the other betrayals and injustices in slavery was the frequency with which people would be promised that they would be freed at the death of the owner. And then they would discover in the will that incredibly important promise had been broken. So Harriet's enslaver dies, and as you say, everybody then is terrified. Everybody knows that this is a moment where it is possible that families will be broken up. And indeed, the enslaver's widow plans to sell people to settle his debts. And so they're all waiting to find out who it's going to be. It might be Harriet. It might be her brothers. They aren't sure who, but they're pretty sure somebody's about to be sold off, and they know exactly what that means. They've already seen their siblings sold south. They've lost sisters. They know what happens. And Harriet decides that she's not waiting her turn. She actually later said, "There was one of two things I had a right to, liberty or death. If I could not have one, I would have the other." So she decides that she will risk her life to escape slavery. And in September 1849, she runs.
And she really is risking her life. She's putting herself into a system of organized slave catchers, of slave patrols, of people with hunting dogs. She knows what this means. She will have seen other people who've attempted to escape, who've been brought back, beaten and bruised and cut. She will have seen the punishments that were meted out of them as response to their escaping. She knows this is a really dangerous thing to do.
Yeah. And if you aren't killed outright for trying to escape, you will be beaten within an inch of your life as a deterrent, both for yourself, of course, but also for others. It is a spectacular punishment that is there to frighten everybody else into not running away. And it's not in the enslaver's best interest to kill you, because then they lose your value, but they will torture you within an inch of your life. And of course, they may, as they often did, miscalculate and then kill people.
Yeah. I think one of the features of Harriet's life that is quite common, that she shares with most of the people around her, is that she's carrying an injury, a disability. When we read the accounts, the descriptions of enslaved people, and later when we get to the 1850s and 60s and we see photographs of enslaved people, they are covered in scars and wounds and handicaps and disabilities that in very many cases have come from these moments of exemplary violence and punishment.
Yeah. You really can't overstate how courageous it was to run for anyone at all. It was also even more dangerous, of course, for a woman. Now, Harriet might have been on her own. We don't know for sure. She was actually named in a fugitive slave notice advertising for her recapture along with her brothers. So it's possible that they fled together. We don't know for sure, but she might have run on her own. Either way, they went without any kind of guide. So it was still a young woman going out into all of that danger, without someone to follow. She just having to figure out how she or they, were going to get away.
The newspapers of the North were full of thousands and thousands of these notices, these descriptions of enslaved people, these offers of reward for their return. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson all issued advertisements for the recapture of their enslaved people. But it is a kind of moment when we see her in print. Yeah. When we do, see this story recorded in the documents for somebody who, up until this point has largely been invisible in terms of, the documentary record. There she is, a description of this moment of courage, of this terrible risk she's taken.
Yeah, it's a really interesting aspect of enslavement that historians, as you know, David, have written about because there is this kind of, it's not quite a paradox, but there is a sort of deep historical irony in that history that is designed to erase these people notices them when they're trying to run away. Yeah. And then we often learn the most about these people, certainly physical descriptions, from a system that's designed to dehumanize them. Suddenly we see individuals at the moment that they're trying to escape the system that dehumanizes them. Yeah. Then suddenly it notices that they have human features because it wants to recapture them.
And it's those advertisements that in some ways are the kind of giveaway of how violent this system is. We talked about the injuries people carry. When they're trying to recover their human property, one of the great ways of doing that is to say, well, they have an identifying feature. So they list the scars. It is the system that likes to tell people who don't know what slavery really is, that it's not that violent, that black people are happy in slavery. When they issue these advertisements, they in some ways have to reveal the truth, that these people are covered in injuries and wounds. Because that's a way of identifying them.
Yeah. And so reading these fugitive slave ads can be really horrifying, but it does give us, as we're saying, at least some information about their identity. And in Harriet Tubman's case, it gives us a physical description of her that is the only description we have of her as a young woman. There are photographs of her when she's much older and famous. But as a young woman, she is described in this ad after she's run away on October 3rd, 1849. It says, Minty, aged about 27 years, is of a chestnut color, fine looking, and about 5 feet high. So we learned from this ad that she was small, that she was basically attractive. Now that fine looking also means, to your point, David, about the disfigurement that followed torture, that she basically doesn't have any identifying scars, and that she has a warm brown complexion. These are the notices that also name her brothers, and so they may or may not have fled with her. And the reason why we're not sure about the exact details of her escape is because she definitely used the Underground Railroad to flee. It's an underground resistance network, as you rightly said, David. So it's highly dangerous work, and you don't keep very many notes if you're running a resistance network, because, of course, you don't want to leave any incriminating evidence.
It's at this point in her life that she comes into contact with a system that she's for the rest of her life going to become associated with, the Underground Railway, these systems of secret passages, secret routes, secret safe houses, secret hiding places that is forever going to be associated with her name, but it existed for decades, probably centuries. She now, because she's desperate not to be sold south, because her family is going to be atomized anyway, she now throws her future into that network and somehow manages to make contact with people who are going to try and help her escape.
Yeah, these networks are really structured exactly like espionage systems, right? They've got cells, they've got secret codes, they've got safe houses, agents, hiding places, and you try to make contact with them. And then you can enter, as it were, board the Underground Railroad. Harriet will herself spend much of her life conducting on the Underground Railroad. So we'll say more as the story goes on about how exactly the whole system worked. But from what Harriet said later, we know a little bit about her own escape to freedom, but not that much. So we know that she mostly traveled at night, which was typical. She hid in the woods or barns or wherever she could by day. Obviously, you don't want to be out when they're looking for you. And then at night, you travel. And what she did was follow the North Star. They all knew the North Star. They knew the Big Dipper. And that's basically your route to freedom. The way that American school children learn the story of Harriet Tubman is that one fact, that she followed the North Star. That's the thing that most people know, is that and there are pictures in children's books of the North Star shining and of Harriet following it. But that was very real. That was often as much information as a fleeing enslaved person had.
North is freedom, south is slavery. It was in some ways that simple. For her specifically in Maryland, the North, the closest part of the North, the closest state that has ended slavery is Pennsylvania, which is about 90 miles away from where she leaves.
Yeah. And Pennsylvania was, in fact, the first state to abolish slavery, largely because of its Quaker population. And it had long been a haven for enslaved people for exactly that reason, because the Quakers looked out for them. But 90 miles is a long road for anyone on foot, let alone an illiterate woman with no money, no map, and now a price on her head, a fugitive notice with people chasing her.
And we should explain that a fugitive notice is an offer of rewards to people who made a living being bounty hunters, basically, being slave catchers. So it's not just it's in the newspapers and people will read Minty Ross has escaped. It's people will read that and go, that's somebody we can get money if we can recapture. The description is there for those bounty hunters to know who they're looking for. So she's on the run.
Mm. She is. And then the big question then becomes, of course, how did she know what to do? How did she know who to contact? How did she reach the Underground Railroad? How do you start? And the answer is that it's a kind of patchwork of the networks that we were talking about at the beginning of the story, and how important it was that people like Harriet and her father and her husband had contacts with people beyond the immediate family of the enslavers. So you could get information. People could pass stories and say, well, that's a safe house. That person will help you. It's a patchwork of trusted people that get built up over the years.
And because it's secretive, we'll never know. So there is certainly, she will have found access to people who knew where to go, who could tell her how this system worked, who could get her kind of on board the Underground Railroad, but they didn't say it. They didn't speak about it. So it's not something that's in the historical records. We get an alert that she's escaped from the slave owner, but we'll never know the details of how that escape was done because it was such a desperately kept secret.
Yeah. Some of the most prominent figures in the Underground Railroad did keep some records. Few of them have survived. A lot of them got destroyed. We know a little bit about some of the more prominent members. And then there were, after the Civil War, there were some recollections that we'll get into as well, which is what has enabled historians to reconstruct how it worked to the extent that we can. But yeah, as you say, we're never going to have the full detailed map of her route to freedom. What there is instead is basically a social network, and that's what they would be following. It's the social network that leads you to freedom, and that's a mix of the Quaker farmers in the area that we were talking about, free Black families, other escaped Black people, formerly enslaved people, a handful of ministers who are resisting the immorality of slavery.
So she's traveling by night. She's hiding during the day, trying to find somewhere in the countryside or in a safe house where she won't be seen and won't be caught. And she's moving every day as fast as she can, moving northwards.
Well, every night as fast as she can, but exactly that. No, yeah, that's right. And so daily, moving as fast as she can, but under cover of darkness. Now, she later said that a white woman helped her on the first leg. So that's one of the few bits of information we have about how she did it, that she was handed a slip of paper with 2 names and directions to the next house. And that's why we say it's like cells in an espionage system where you know the next one, but not necessarily everyone on the route.
We presume that she will have been given instructions the moment she's got that information that she'll burn, or she'll get rid of those records. It's a dangerous thing to be found with any detail of how the system operates. So we don't have records because the records are incriminating documents for the people who wrote them or received them.
Although for one leg of the route, it also crucially serves as a pass. So you have to hang on to it and make sure that nobody finds you with it, because then you give it to the next person to show that you're not a double agent, as it were, that you're not actually going to betray everyone. You've been given it by a trusted source. You are who you say you are, and then they'll destroy it. And then they tell you what the next step in your journey is. So it's basically you just move along one trusted contact at a time. So when she reaches the first stop with the white woman who's going to help her, the woman told her to take a broom and sweep the yard. And Harriet was taken aback, she said, because she was like, what's this woman putting me to work? I'm trying to escape and she's making me clean her yard. But of course it was camouflage. In case anyone was watching, it was a cover story. And then the woman's husband put Harriet into a wagon, hid her under vegetables, and drove her to the next farm north. They also would have sent word ahead to Philadelphia so that they activate the chain so that people know that she's en route and that house by house they need to be looking out for her so that she'll be met when she arrives. And from there, it's just step by step. And for Harriet, apart from that first ride in the wagon, which will have made things a little bit easier, if not any safer, after that, the rest of her journey was on foot as she moves toward the Delaware line, which is the state that stands between Maryland, where she was enslaved, and freedom in Pennsylvania. She still has to get through the other slave state of Delaware. And from there, she can get to the freedom she seeks.
And next time what we'll do is we'll pick up that moment when she crosses the line between North and South, between slavery and freedom, and how she makes the quite remarkable decision to go backwards, to reverse that journey and become someone not who uses the Underground Railway to escape, but someone who becomes a conductor, a guide on the Underground Railway, who puts herself back in danger, back in the world of slavery to save others.
So thanks for listening and join us next time.